All right, lesson 1 for Unit 4. A lot of snap, crackle, and pop going on here with the progressives and the progressive era. 3 decades worth of reform and change. Check out the continuum at the bottom there. We're halfway through to the New Deal. On the left side, there's no written response for your essential question in your notebook, but you should complete this Venn diagram. Complete that Venn diagram with the information I show you in a few minutes or a couple seconds. The second essential question, I know that says essential question number 2. Put that on a second left-hand side. You got a lot of left and right-hand sides here in this first lesson. Put that on another left side. Just make this simple T-chart. Just list. No need to define. Just list all the major reforms and programs and changes going on under each president. I would encourage you to label them E for economic or P for political, so you can kind of see where the trend and the reform was strongest under which president, and overall what was the greater focus in this reform movement. Again, these 2 essential questions, the first 2 left sides, no need to write a written response, just chart it out, get the details down. There's a lot of stuff going on here. We're moving again toward the New Deal. And we've been in the populist movement, the Grangers, the farmers, the farm alliances. The farmers planted the seeds of change, right? Good one. Yes, I know. Planted the seeds of change. Not a lot happened during that populist movement, but the ideas and the reforms and the momentum was built up there. And you notice the overlap here, 1896, 1900, progressivism. We can really say it's going on in 1900 as well, because there's a social gospel movement and social gospelers that are kind of tying it and moving things along. And there are some muckraker writers in there that are getting some things going. We're really looking at about 1890, excuse me, is what I like to see as the beginnings of that progressive movement. We're just different people who are running with it. They're going to pull along the rest of America, though. That rural American countryside, the farmers, the Grangers, the populists are going to dive into it as well. A lot is going to happen here right in the middle. What doesn't happen is going to continue on in the New Deal. We're moving toward increasingly less laissez-faire and more government regulation of the economy. Populists and progressives, who are they? Well, again, our farmers are progressives. We're farmers, southern, western America, rural America, from the south and the west. Some support from factory workers, although they were a little torn over some of the issues and got pressure from their employers about things involving the tariff and such. But there's the list of things we talked about. The progressives are really a different class of people from a different region of the country, the north and the east. The urban America, remember our social gospelers and the settlement houses and the settle house movement, and Jane Addams were in those urban areas, and the social gospel movement was in those urban areas trying to deal with the massive populations that are moving into urban areas and experiencing very difficult lives, trying to help them assimilate in various ways. The progressives are also concerned about assimilation, but the type of people they are listed there: journalists, professionals, educators, intellectuals, kind of an emerging middle class of people that have some time and desire to go ahead and start pushing forward and keep going with the agendas that were begun by the populists, but they're going to be expanded on. And so if you look left to right, it's very similar. Just make sure you go ahead and complete that chart on your first left side. All I want you to do is jot that stuff down and write it down. This is one of the key differences, but both of them, all right, key differences in who they are and where they're from, but the similarity is that they all believe government should be involved in being a more significant actor in the welfare of the people. They should use, or government should use, its power. It's important to review our isms here a little bit, because progressives, are they radical? Yes, they're radical for the time, but what they're not is communists. The communist philosophy is that there should be economic equality, and all resources and industry is going to be owned by the government, and it's going to be redistributed, and production is going to happen by the government for the benefit of everybody. There's no private property. Our socialists are kind of halfway in between, with some extremes, maybe a little bit to the left of the communists, toward the communist side as well, but they're going to see that there are social and economic problems that need to be dealt with, but would probably rather prefer that government owns some of the most important industries and resources, like railroads and telegraphs that we talked about before, but maybe also use the democratic political process to make it happen. There's no violent revolution here, although people are concerned that that's maybe what they are promoting. A few radicals within the socialist movement might even talk about violence. And again, our socialist movement is often associated with and connected to our labor unions. The progressives, however, like everyone else, see serious concerns or have very serious concerns about the social development of the country. The Second Industrial Revolution is causing us to go through some serious changes and serious growing pains, violent labor strikes. There are problems that need to be dealt with, but the way in which they want to deal with them is very different. They do not accept any government ownership of property, the means of production and resources. But these are important words here. Circle them. Regulate industry, establish some rules to play by, and reform government. Get rid of the corruption. Right? Regulate and reform. Set up some rules. The progressives really can be fit into four categories. They're not a single unified movement. There's a lot of them moving and changing or moving and doing their own thing, really focused on a particular pet project or particular area. Some are in multiple areas, but there's a social reform movement aspect to the movement, and there's a moral aspect, there's an economic and political aspect to the movement. But they all believe that the government should do a few things. One, the government should be more accountable to the citizens. Government is for the people, right? Some key documents there that we should think of when we hear that phrase. Government should curb the power and influence of the wealthy, and that government should be expanded in its power to help improve the lives of people. And we can make government more efficient and less corrupt. There's a strong scientific mindset here amongst progressives as well, and that science can help improve things, and that we can come up with a better, more improved democracy, republic, capitalist system. We're not going to destroy the house. We're just going to modify it. We're going to make it house, capitalism, democracy, republic 2.0. All right. Who's driving it? What's at the bottom end of things? What's getting it going? The progressive movement is heavily influenced, and we could argue that maybe these are the key people, by writers and journalists who were informing people about what the problems were. They each focus on a particular area of the economy or the political system or of society that they were concerned with. They write books, they write articles, they publish papers. They're investigative reporters. If you think of some of the investigative news programs, 2020, for example, maybe being one of them, their goal is to inform the populace, get them into a position where enough of them are angry or upset about it through that information process, and then you've got a critical mass to try and get them to put pressure on government to make the change happen. One of the most important here is Upton Sinclair, who Teddy Roosevelt read, and he read all of these things. He wasn't so happy with these journalists and writers. He'll give them a nickname, the muckrakers, but he did read them, and he was influenced by them. But what's driving the calls for change? Again, there's a lot of social, political, economic growing pains going on here. We've talked about a little of them already. This is not in your notes, but just to review where we've been. Industry, monopolies, wages not going up, significant numbers of people living in poverty, work days significantly long and difficult. I believe in 1890, some of the average work weeks are about 100 hours a week, somewhere in there. Workers have no right, no power, no legal protection. The labor supply is too high. Kids are working to support the family. Child labor is a major problem. Overpopulation, poverty, disease, crime, government corruption, political machines, the spoils system, all of that. It's important to remember that laissez-faire is really strongly in the minds of most Americans, but it's becoming a little less so because of these conditions. The government's role largely has been that we're not responsible for, or it's not responsible for people's individual welfare. We're living in a state of free nature, society. Rugged individualism, survival of the fittest. You reap what you sow. If bad things happen to you, you just got to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and do your own thing and make it happen for yourself. You can't go asking government to help out, and pointing fingers at somebody else didn't really work either. It's a free society. If we have more government involvement, we're less free, and if we especially get involved in the economy, people aren't going to be willing to work and work harder. These progressive presidents, two of them here, the next one is going to be Teddy Roosevelt, really fear that a possible revolution could happen. Remember that communist mindset, Joseph Engels, Karl Marx philosophy, Leninism. It's out there. We're not in an official communist country yet. That's 1919 in the Soviet Union, Russia, but it's out there, and it is a strong movement. They don't believe that the system should be scrapped. We just need to, again, make it 2.0, fix it, improve upon it. But with this, government power is going to increase. So it is kind of an emergency situation that develops over time, and it's bad enough that political leaders are elected into office by the people to make these changes. And the muckrakers and our writers and journalists are helping fuel that. The radical communists, of course, would say it's flawed, scrap it, start all over. Our first and our most important to begin with progressive president is Teddy Roosevelt. He's considered to be our first modern president because of the fact that he has this belief that a president should be strong and take action. Previous presidents, unless it was a war, i.e. Mr. Abraham Lincoln, were not strong, did not take action. They just kind of did their thing, and the Congress passed laws, and he signed them if he approved of them, and that's about it. Then the laws didn't really get into people's lives for the most part. Again, it was laissez-faire. The government should be responsible for the people's welfare, but also promote the growth of industry. So he's a Republican, but he's a new kind of Republican. He's a moderate. And he was very much influenced by his father, who was a strong Christian reformist man, and he once told him that if your life isn't about serving people and helping other people, then it's a life that's lost or wasted. And that's something that Teddy Roosevelt gradually grew into as he kind of saw what was going on with common people. He grew up in a wealthy home. He was well known. His family is well known in New York, and he did not hurt for anything. But he becomes famous through our Spanish-American War, which we haven't covered yet, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But after that, he is able, through that fame, to become New York City Chief of Police, elected to the House of Representatives in New York, Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and eventually Governor of New York. And all those positions, he tried to set up rules and standards and clean up corruption, make sure his police officers were carrying the right gun, they all had a common uniform, that they weren't sloughing off on the job, that they weren't taking bribes for people to give them protection, all that kind of thing. And essentially, he's doing things that were against the political machines, even though the political machines put him in his positions. And he's kind of messing things up significantly. And the position of vice president came open for the election of 1900, which is the second attempt to become president or to rerun again for Mr. McKinley. And the political machine in New York said, let's get him out of here. They're ruining our little deal here and our good situation and our corruptness. And let's put him in the vice presidency, put him up to become vice president. And that was considered to be a position of no political power. He couldn't mess things up or change or modify or go after reform there, because the Constitution doesn't really give the vice president any political power, and the presidents didn't either. It was kind of a do-nothing kind of a position. So he becomes vice presidential nominee in the election of 1900. McKinley is elected, and immediately McKinley is assassinated, and we have a wacko loose in the White House. And this cartoon kind of portrays how people responded to Teddy Roosevelt, because he doesn't listen to the political machine. He's an individual that pretty much goes by his own rules, and if he thinks it's the right thing to do, then he's going to do it. Doesn't matter who it is, bar none, I'm going to do that. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901. He's going to serve out the last 3 years of McKinley's term in office, and he is going to, in his first attempt on his running for his own position as president, going to run on the square deal. It's going to be called the 3 C's. And these 3 C's will focus on cleaning up the country and protecting the common person, but also protecting the interests of big business and industry, because that's good for the public also. The election of 1904 had other political parties forming in it. A lot of change here. Things are moving. Didn't get any votes in terms of electoral college, but things are moving in terms of politics. Things are starting to shift, and political viewpoints are very fluid. But the 3 C's of the square deal involve conservation. This is the most important thing you need to remember from Teddy Roosevelt. He was a great hunter. After his presidency, he goes out and he hunts everything that possibly can walk or move. If you go see his house in Oyster Bay in Long Island, not upstate New York, but on Long Island, New York, you'll see all kinds of animal heads in that house. And there he is, dressed up in his Western cowboy garb and his fancy engraved rifle. I believe he's out in North Dakota there. After the death of his wife and his mother that happened on the same day, he went out there and became a cowboy for the next couple of years and roughed it. He's a great outdoorsman. His father told him he had to build himself up because he had severe emphysema, and if he didn't, he might not live a long life. And so that's what he did. He was a very outdoorsy, athletic kind of a guy. There's some pictures out there you can find of him in the buff, kind of not in the full buff, but he's got his shirt off and he's a pretty stout looking young man. But he goes out to the Badlands of North Dakota, and he basically is a cowboy for a good year plus or more, something like that. And this coming from a New Yorker, an upstate high society person, and he does everything those cowboys do, and he earns their respect. There is a national forest out there called Teddy Roosevelt National Forest. Cool place to see. Millions of acres of land as president are put under his protection. Sometimes he does it without Congress's approval. He just does it by executive order, which irritates members of Congress, and people say he's exercising his powers kind of like a king. National parks, wildlife preserves, things like that. Here he's meeting with John Muir, who's going to be a co-founder, or was the co-founder of the Sierra Club out in Yosemite National Park. Mentioned that Roosevelt is a very athletic dude. He's into sports and athletics. And about the time he was president, 1905-ish, 1900, football was on the verge of being banned by Congress because of the violence of it and the number of deaths that were happening. And Teddy Roosevelt stepped in and said, we're going to come up with some rules of how the game is played to make it less violent. Sounds like some things going on today, perhaps. Very soon, and around that time, I believe in that whole process, the forward pass was developed and that kind of thing to kind of stop it from just people beating on each other down after down. He also had sumo wrestlers come to the East Room of the White House and demonstrate wrestling. I'm not sure if he actually wrestled them or not. I believe he had asked to have a demonstration of some sort, maybe lightly. So he wasn't that big of a guy. Control of corporations, the second C. The best example you need to read about and know about is the 1902 coal strike. Everybody needed coal in the country. That strike was so big and so massive that it threatened to literally bring the country to a point where people would freeze to death in their homes because there was no coal to burn in their furnaces to keep them warm in the winter. It was a public issue. He forces those mine owners to sit down and negotiate something to get the coal produced again. Otherwise, he threatened to bring in the military. Broke Dozens' trust. He's the first to use the Sherman Antitrust Act. Here he is in the biblical story of as Daniel in the lion's den and taming all the lions of the trusts. His involvement in taming those trusts came down to kind of a determination as to some that were good and some that were bad. He wasn't against all trusts. Some trusts he felt were good and were beneficial to the country. Others were not. But during his time, as you can kind of see, and it was happening before a little bit, the corporate mergers and the monopolies that were being formed goes down, a little bit up and then down here. Here's Teddy Roosevelt after his ascension to the presidency. This is a time period also where consumers and what people buy is very risky. Caveat emptor is the rule, let the buyer beware. Patent medicines are anywhere. You can make up any medicine you want, stick it in a bottle and sell it as a cure from everything from cancer to diarrhea, and it would be not a problem. The problem was that many of these things had things like cocaine and opium and alcohol and who knows what in it. Probably not healthy for you in a lot of cases. Upton Sinclair, one of our muckrakers here, is significant in helping bring about some significant change in this area. He writes a book about the meatpacking plants in Chicago and the conditions for workers and how bad they are. However, Teddy Roosevelt, the public reads this and says, man, we're not really worried about the conditions of the workers. We're worried about the condition of the food that we've got here, and the rot and the maggots and things like that, and the lack of inspections and all that kind of thing. And this is going to result into the significant pieces of legislation involving the Pure Food and Drug Act that you have in your snap charts, and the Meat Inspection Act and those types of things. But Teddy Roosevelt, his term in office is very active, a lot of things going on, and he's very close to 8 years in office, and he's asked, will you run again, because he's only got one of his own, and he says, no, I'm not going to. If I run again, then I would go beyond George Washington's term, two-term limit, and that's just not right. And so he says, I'm not going to do that. But he's going to regret that. And some in this, like in this cartoon, would argue that maybe he's becoming too king-like and too emperor-like a Caesar here. He's not going to run in 1908. But he's going to come back and try again. Choose the successor. His successor is Vice President William Howard Taft. Never really wanted to be president. Completely different personality. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt goes on about 4 hours of sleep at night, I think, something like that. He is very high-strung and high energy. William Taft is not that kind of person, but he runs and he wins the presidency for the Republican Party out of loyalty in 1908. He runs against William Jennings Bryan. Remember him, the populist that became the Democratic candidate that lost the election to McKinley in 1896. He still wins the South and some of those western states, right? Here's Nevada silver, but it's not enough to dethrone the Republicans. Does Taft continue TR square deal? Well, yes, he pretty much does. He achieves greater conservation gains really than Roosevelt does, broke more trusts than Roosevelt does. The most notable is the breaking of the Standard Oil Trust in 1911, which was heavily impacted by, and probably more about, the muckraker Ida Tarbell, who wrote about the history of Standard Oil and their business practices and treatment of workers and all that kind of thing. No Ida Tarbell. A little chart here to kind of show when Standard Oil was broken up, it became all these oil companies, and over time, if you follow the line here, you maybe recognize some of these others out here. They become the ones that we know today. So the big oil gas companies that we know today were at one point in time connected to Standard Oil. As president or presidential candidate, he promised to lower tariffs, but under the Payne-Aldrich tariff passed in 1909, it actually overall generally increased. Teddy Roosevelt and other progressive Republicans, especially in the West, were really angry about that. This is going to cause a split in the party. And then there's this Ballinger-Pinchot controversy or affair, and it was a fight between this Secretary of the Interior Ballinger and a guy named Pinchot, who was a close ally of Teddy Roosevelt, chief of the Forestry Department. And here you can see him there. Here's Taft, and then there's Ballinger, and they were, one criticized the other. Pinchot criticized the other for maybe not doing enough to preserve western lands from mining, and it was considered to be insubordinate, and so Taft fired Pinchot, and then Teddy, who's off hunting somewhere in Africa or South America or somewhere, is irritated, and he says, I'm coming back. I want it back. And so in 1912, he's going to campaign for the Republican nomination, and it's going to be under a slogan called New Nationalism: business regulation, welfare laws, workplace protection for women and children, income and inheritance taxes. That's an attack against the rich. He's upper class. And voting reform. Here he is coming back from African horse. Notice where his left foot is, right foot, back in the United States. Greeting Uncle Sam. And notice he's bigger than Uncle Sam, right? Big dude, big, powerful personality. Oops. If you get a chance and you're interested, check out the article that I have on the wiki about TR almost getting shot. Well, not almost getting shot. He was shot. There it is. There's the shirt on the left. There's the bullet that went through his speech and his container holding his glasses on the right. It saved his life. Tough dude. Comes up with a slogan. I'm a bull moose. I feel strong. He gets up and he speaks for about another 90 minutes while he's bleeding. People were impressed with that. But there's turmoil in the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt sought again this nomination. He loses to Taft. The Republicans don't choose him. Notice the Republican elephant running away, and Teddy's blowing up. We are going to have now Democrats who are more reform-minded than old school Republicans, and Republican progressives, the Teddys of the world, join together and forming this bull moose party. There he is. Big teeth, glasses, a new animal at the political zoo. What are they going to be about? He's going to run and be a heavy impactor in the third, as a third party in this election. He's going to attract votes from that Democratic Party, but he's perhaps also going to attract votes from the Republican Party. Who will he draw from most? Well, we'll see in just a second, but it's important to know that he, in his BUMUS New Nationalism program, he promoted the initiative, recall, and referendum. Know those definitions, very important. These are a big deal in the local, state, and he's proposing these on the national level. Women's suffrage, which he wasn't before, end child labor, minimum wage, maximum hours worked, popular election of senators, all of that. There's 3 candidates who are running for the presidency in here, and again, the Socialist Party running again in 1912, and Wilson wins. Teddy Roosevelt pulls votes away from the Republicans and helps the Democrat Wilson win. And as Wilson ran for the presidency, he ran on something called the New Freedom. He's got a strict, strong religious upbringing. We'll talk about him more with World War I and imperialism. Humanitarian, believes in a strong president as well. He's heavily opposed, though, to suffrage. He's very old school that way. Reformed governor from New Jersey, but he runs on the triple wall of privilege. I'm going to attack it. And he does it in the area of banks, trusts, and tariffs, and all those things right there. And he may be the most significant, have the most impact on the economy of any of those other 2 presidents. Know him. Make sure you get your 2 left sides. Again, no written response. Just go ahead and make a Venn diagram and a simple 3-way T-chart listing things on the next 2 left-hand sides. And we're ready to go on to our next topic of reform. Who did it not help? Where was reform absent? Who lost out? Who was on the short end of the stick? Good day. Make the hay.